Okay. Now it looks like your side screen.
How about now?
Perfect.
Excellent. Hi, everybody. Thank you for hanging in with me, and for folks that were excited to hear me speak in March. I'm very happy you're not listening to me give this presentation in my bathtub because of tornadoes. So I personally think this is a little bit more comfortable. Today I'm going to be talking primarily about invasive species, but from the standpoint of invasive species ecology. If you want to know how to knock out Johnson grass and things like that, there's plenty of resources, but I'm going to talk about how invasive species actually function and what it means for prairie ecosystems as a whole and prairies as a system in general. So there are a lot of commonly heard terms related to where a species comes from. Hopefully by the end of this presentation, it will be a lot clearer for everyone. But you've likely heard invasive species, introduced species, non-native species, aggressive native species, naturalized and native. So hopefully these will all be a little bit clearer by the time I'm done. But it's important to make a distinction because there is a very specific definition for what an invasive species is. So it is an organism that causes ecological and/or economic harm. The emphasis here is on the harm. So it's not enough that you have a species introduced to a new environment. It has to have some sort of impact, whether that's just purely ecological or if it's fiscal, or often both. Now, some of you have already mentioned my wife, Megan, who absolutely loves spiders, which, by the way, completely unrelated. She's giving a talk tomorrow. But this drove her absolutely bonkers in March. I'm not sure if any of you caught these headlines when they were literally all over the place. My personal favorite was giant spiders expected to drop from the sky across East Coast this spring. And I just have this beautiful mental picture of them with their web spun parachutes just dropping down on unsuspecting people in Georgia. But realistically, the Jaro spider has been in Georgia since 2014. So they've been there for 6 years, just minding their own business, quietly introduced. And according to all the arachnologists in that area, they're just filling an unoccupied niche. They're not impacting the native insects. They're not outcompeting the native spiders. They're just quietly minding their beeswax until somebody decided that they were going to parachute from the sky. So that's why it's important to make a distinction between an invasive species and an introduced one. And honestly, this is the preferred outcome. And then they came from China, I believe. And they're one of many invasive spiders in a similar family. Most of them are pretty innocuous. And then we have our aggressive natives. So they're supposed to be here. That's perfectly okay. We want them to be here. What we don't want is for conditions to present themselves where their more aggressive nature then overtakes an ecosystem and produces a monoculture. So I'm going to be talking about aggressive natives today a little bit as well, because I have to. I'm a prairie person. We all have to shake our hands at woody invasion. So where do invasives come from? In Texas, the answer is literally everywhere. It is China, it is Japan. We have grasses introduced from Europe. Most of our turf grasses come from tropical countries. You name it, we have something from somewhere. But what folks don't realize is we've actually managed to introduce species to where they don't belong from opposite sides of our own country. So my favorite example of this, because guilty as charged, I have a bird background, is the house finch. So around the 1960s, it was viewed as a really attractive cage bird. So they had them in New York City for people to have in their house. And as you can expect, some of those didn't stay in those cages, whether they were intentionally released or accidentally released. And by the 1990s, over here on that right-hand side, their range has almost converged. So, and despite their very cute appearance, they do compete with birds on the East Coast for nesting habitat. So they weren't really ready for that, and despite being from the US, they fit that invasive species definition in that part of the range. But honestly, most of the invasive species we have, whether we're talking Texas or other parts of the world, are introduced intentionally. Humans have this habit, for good or bad, of taking things that we like and plopping them in wherever we're going. So whether that is livestock or plants, if it serves a use for us or we think we can apply it in some way, it's going to come with us. Particularly plants that fit a need, so not necessarily just food plants, but up until recently, to control soil erosion along the side of roads, they would plant non-native grasses because they view them as growing faster and being more effective at controlling soil erosion than the natives. So if it fits a need, we're going to use it. And honestly, because we like them. So another example of New York City causing bird havoc for the rest of the country is the European starling. So whether or not there's enough evidence to actually support the rumor that someone brought them over because they wanted all of Shakespeare's birds to be in the US, either way, they still ended up spreading from New York to covering the complete country. And again, it's just because somebody happened to like starlings and thought that they should be here. Now it's a massive invasive species. And there are plenty of accidental movements too. We live in an increasingly interconnected world. We can feel that, especially over the last 2 years. But anything that can ride a plane is going to ride a plane. So what you see on the right-hand side are snake sniffing dogs. I'm sorry if I'm in the way for the folks that are here. I'm trying to bob and weave. But the snake sniffing dogs are looking particularly for arboreal snakes in Hawaii and often used in Guam, because the birds and mammals that are on island countries, island nations, are not accustomed to having snake predators. They've evolved without them. As you can imagine, that has had a really, really devastating influence on birds in those locations. So they employ really cute dogs to find them in wheel wells and baggage, and anywhere you think you could possibly literally hide a snake on a plane. Boats move basically everything. You've probably seen the TPWD campaigns against the zebra mussel. Import of agricultural products, that's likely how we've gotten most of our, hopefully, not parachuting spiders. Most people don't think of their shoes, and I have a particularly deadly example of invasive species moving by people's shoes in a little bit, and of course, baggage. But perhaps the one that causes the most internet arguments is related to pets, because we're very emotionally attached to our animals. But a lot of folks that end up in over their head tend to do the thing of releasing them into the environment, hoping that they're going to have a happier life. That's how Billy the boa ended up taking over the Everglades, unfortunately. But more controversially is the household pets. So outdoor cats that are running around, they're absolutely decimating native birds, mammals, herps, you name it. Same with dogs in other countries. If they're here because we love them, chances are they're not supposed to be here. But what makes a successful invader? And by the way, that's the range map for the European starling from earlier. So they're everywhere. Being a generalist is the best way to go. And of course, in biology, there's exceptions to the rule. So don't quote me that every invasive is going to be a generalist, but most of them are. It means they're able to adapt to an incredibly wide amount of environmental conditions, soil conditions. They're able to eat a wide variety of different things. And they're just very good at adapting to whatever condition that they're in. Most of them produce numerous cheap offspring. For plants, we're talking an incredible amount of seed. For animals, we're talking multiple egg clutches. Think rabbits, for example. Rabbits are an incredibly nasty invader in Australia. The more offspring, the worse the invasion usually is. Perennials are particularly nasty to try to manage. That's because if they can spread by root and seed, it is really hard to try and keep them contained. And anything that comes to a novel environment with any sort of defense mechanism becomes incredibly difficult for native species to try and deal with. So for plants, that could be releasing chemicals into the soil. For animals, that could be something like the cane toad in Australia. It took many, many years for the native species to figure out to flip them over so they could actually eat them. And to put all of this into economic context, this is a figure pulled from this paper in 2021. They were just looking at the economic impacts for 2020 for North America. That figure is 26 billion per year, just for North America to control our invasive species. That is what we spend. Most of that is because of agricultural outputs and trying to protect things like that. But yeah. In Texas, as far as I can estimate, it's in the millions. I cannot find a figure for what we spend on terrestrial invasive species control, but just for zebra mussels as of 2016, the estimated budget was 3.2 million. So it's an incredibly expensive problem. But what has no actual financial figure to it is the loss of biodiversity. It's not really something that we can measure very easily. And often what we see is that native species are not prepared to deal with new predators and new pests. In this case, this is probably everyone's favorite insect in Texas, which is the fire ants. I would like to soapbox for a second to say that they have managed to give our native fire ants a bad reputation. And yes, we do have native ones in addition to the invaders. But what they have done since coming to Texas is hit already imperiled nesting bird populations, especially those that are on the ground. So bobwhite quail that are already declining, they have nest failures attributed to fire ants. Whooping cranes do as well. And some of the waders. So this is one of the heron chicks. It breaks up evolutionary relationships. Particularly, we're losing host and food plants for important pollinators. The monarch, unfortunately, has been in the news recently for all the wrong reasons. Hopefully you have seen that it was listed by the IUCN as endangered. I would like to note that is different than having protections in the US. It is still not federally listed under the Endangered Species Act. But the example for that is tropical milkweeds. Especially during that really nasty frost we had, folks that were very invested in their monarchs were trying to find any milkweed they could. A lot of them ended up with tropical milkweeds, which are not going to quite fit that bill. And in California, there's actually studies showing that folks that plant tropical milkweeds instead of natives can cause monarchs to think it's time to breed rather than time to migrate. So you're starting to break those linkages. And outside of just sheer habitat loss, insect decline is native species getting replaced by invasives is the second largest contributor to insect decline. And when we look at that worldwide, and I honestly expect that this percentage is probably way low, that's about 45% of our insect species are declining. I expect that's way higher. Outcompeting native species. So the tree of heaven is one of those we brought here because we thought it was pretty. But I don't know how many people who planted realize that it actually secretes chemicals to outcompete other plants nearby it. So it plays a little bit of chemical warfare in the soil. But the reason I wanted to bring up the tree of heaven, not just because it outcompetes natives, because I want everyone who's in this room and on this call to be forewarned. And that is because of this guy. So that is the spotted lanternfly, which comes from a very similar region. It's actually very adapted to using the tree of heaven where it occurs naturally. So what we're seeing now in the East Coast is that where there is tree of heaven, we're seeing increased amounts of spotted lanternfly, which is already almost beyond the point of containment. And I fully expect it will hit Texas. It's just a matter of when, just because of how prolific it is. So if you have a tree of heaven that you've hated for any reason, Now is the time to advocate to get rid of it because the spotted lanternflies are definitely coming. And here is why, if you go to visit anywhere for ecotourism and get all up in the soil and have a real good adventuring time, you need to sterilize your shoes. So it's not just plants and animals. We can introduce invasive parasites and disease. This is white nose syndrome. It started in 2006 in Albany, New York. It has spread rather rapidly. The reason why I bring it up as a particularly nasty example of invasive disease is that it wiped out most of our bat populations very quickly. Biologists would go check on bats and find 90 to 100% of the population inside those caves dead. Very particularly grim, caused by the Geomyces destruction fungus. That's what causes that white face that gives the syndrome its name. What it does is it actually eats up their stored fat and it makes them starve to death. It has significantly impacted Texas bat species as well, despite early projections that it would not be acclimated to such a warm soil type. So it is here. And it traveled to the US on somebody's shoes from Europe. So if you go anywhere exciting, make sure you sterilize your shoes. I used to work in the tropics and I would throw out my boots every single time I would leave, just for precisely this reason. But we're prairie people, and most of our problems revolve around invasive grasses. In the Great Plains alone, there's an estimated 104 invasive grasses. I suspect that that number is probably increased, as these things normally do. And in Texas in particular, a lot of these, especially towards the Texas Panhandle, were intentionally introduced. Early conservation reserve program grasses meant to help stabilize soil. When they first embarked in Texas, the program first started, they used a lot of species like old world blue stems that they thought would fill a similar ecological role to native blue stems, which gave us a lot of really fun, nasty species that we now try to get rid of. And also a lot of improved pasture programs too. But the reason why invasive grasses are particularly nasty, not just for changing habitat or potential relationships evolutionarily, but also what it means to prairie ecosystem function. So I promise not to run up and point. So I'll circle the mouse first, and then I'll go run up and point, because that's how I roll. So this bugger here on the left is an introduced grass species. Notice how itty bitty its root system is. Our switch grasses reach 12 feet by comparison. And some of our native forbs, like compass plants, reach as far down as 15 feet. So why do we care about an invasive species swap for root system? Well, prairies thrive on roots, and they're particularly important to us too. The reason why prairies are so amazingly good at carbon sequestration is because most of their biomass is in their roots. It actually makes them better than forests. So if you have any especially aggressive pro-tree people, you can remind them of that. The prairies are awesome. They're also amazing at water filtration for precisely that reason. The deeper and more in-depth the root system, the more likely it is to slow down and pull some of that nastiness out of your water, which in a state that has limestone aquifers, I would argue is particularly important. But this one for me seals the deal, why we should be really cautious about having high numbers of invasive grasses, especially in working lands as well as in our cities, is this factoid. So prairies can absorb 250,000 gallons per acre. Per acre, because of that crazy root system. And if you don't believe me, there's plenty of really good water conservation boards and soil conservation boards that will have a display set up where they have native grasses, introduced turf grasses, and bare soil. They will pour water through them all. You see a little trickle in the natives. The turf grass basically goes straight through. The soil, as you would expect, is like nothing's there. It makes a very big difference. So caring about invasive species impacts us too in a variety of different ways. But I would be remiss to talk about invasives without also talking about the fact that Texas, as we know, is fundamentally changing. It is urbanizing very, very quickly. In fact, if we look at DFW in the 1980s, in particular, these northern regions, basically between Plano and McKinney, all the way up and around, by the time we hit 2021, you will have noticed that we have managed to fill in most of that open space, which means a couple of different things for prairies. In particular, it means we're losing those large contiguous habitats like the one on the left, which means you're potentially reducing the complexity of the communities and also reducing the stability of those species. But it also means you're increasing edge habitat. So anywhere we cut a road, anywhere we put a house, we now have an interface between that native grassland and something that is different. That is likely, honestly, going to be planted with an invasive species. And in Texas, this is going to be more and more of a common problem. Population projections for increase in Texas are incredibly high for the next couple of years. And just as of 2017 already, almost 60% of landowners in Texas had under 100 acres. So you're going to see smaller and smaller parcels throughout the state, which means more and more edge and potentially more people bringing in lovely things like Chinese privet because it looks and smells good. Anytime you have an edge, it's going to favor opportunistic species. Scabiosa is one, the pincushion. Johnson grass is another fan favorite to try and get rid of. You name it, if it's opportunistic, it's going to thrive in an edge. And as we get smaller and smaller and we lose the complexity of those prairies, they're going to be more vulnerable to that invasion. So not only are we providing an increased interface, we're making them more vulnerable by potentially reducing that community to begin with. And as invasive species add that extra pressure, we're then more likely to see species either extirpate, so be completely gone from a location, or potentially go extinct. But in prairies, urbanization comes with other factors. So it's not just the edge effect, though that's nasty enough on its own. It also changes the disturbance regimes that we need. And we need them because prairies are a disturbance-dependent ecosystem. If you do not burn them, if you do not graze them, if you do not mow them, they will not stay grass. Ecological succession of plant communities always wants to run towards forest. The only way that prairies are kept open is by having something disturb them enough that they're not taken over by woodland. And with increasing urbanization comes a big change to a lot of those regimes, especially in those smaller pockets. A big one is fire. Most folks are incredibly fire adverse. I completely understand it. It is very scary. My phone is actually still on in my pocket because I have a wildfire 20 minutes from my house right now. It is just the state of what it is. But historically, lightning strikes would have burned thousands of acres. And prairies being a relatively young ecosystem of around 10,000 years or so, more or less co-evolved with people. There have been prescribed burns since there have been prairies. And they would burn on an interval between 3 and 10 years. It depends on where you are in the state. Tall grass actually tends to burn more often, so we're in the area that should burn more frequently, by the way. And it is an absolutely critical tool from an invasive species standpoint. Without fire, it is almost impossible for some organizations to control woody invasion. This is actually one of our properties post-burn. And it can be incredibly expensive and difficult to control some of the forbs and grasses that we have without burning. Not to mention all the positive impacts that burning has on prairie communities. But just as an invasive species control is absolutely essential. And I would argue it's essential just for Texans to have in our state in a prescribed manner for a variety of different reasons, but this is the big one. If you haven't seen it yet, we are in a record wildfire year. Part of that is due to excessive drought and the fact that we had a really stellar rainfall year last year. So there's a lot of biomass on the ground. But part of that too is that if we do not prescribe burn and we leave an incredible amount of thatch and fuel on the ground and do not preemptively burn it or do something with it, we're more inclined for wildfires. And hopefully the one that's by my house stays very far away. But wildfire is by far the best tool that we have against junipers, particularly eastern red cedars. So this is a aggressive native that has absolute potential under many projections to go completely out of control. Right now, encroachment is about 10 million hectares just in Oklahoma and Texas. That's not counting the rest of the Great Plains. It's arguably way worse in the eastern part of Kansas. And without fire, they become very much a predominant species if you don't have manpower to individually cut and stump treat every single juniper. But there's another reason to argue for folks to burn your cedars, and that is they like going up like Roman candles. They are incredibly volatile, and goodness forgive if they go up on their own because of their height. They then project embers, which spreads wildfires and makes them really hard to control. So preemptively burning them, really great way to make sure you're not spreading embers in an uncontrolled fashion in acres and acres of other Roman candles. By comparison, way down here, the grass fire is much, much lower. It's actually a lot easier to control from a wildfire standpoint. So keeping them under control is a safety hazard too. But there are other invasive dynamics that are important to watch out for wildfire regime changes in a changing Texas. One that folks have not heard of quite as much in this part of the world is cheatgrass. Although according to INAT, it is here and is here in fairly good abundance in the Metroplex. And the reason I bring this up in relationship to fire, not only is it a very pesky annual that likes occupying anywhere that's disturbed, but it has been quoted, and I will read the quote, from the University of Nevada, that when it catches fire on a windy day, you can produce flames of 8 feet, despite being a grass, a relatively low profile one at that, and it can move at speeds at 4.5 miles per hour. It is a massive problem in Oregon. It is also a massive problem in Nevada, where this quote comes from. It is in Texas, which is something to keep an eye on. And this is another case where prescribed burns helps, especially when it's still in small numbers. Cheatgrass is not. Cheatgrass is introduced, I believe, also from China. I do not, but I can look into it for you. Fair enough. But especially out in Oregon and Nevada, like I said, it's the bane of every manager's existence, and it is a massive fire hazard for everybody who lives there. The other big disturbance factor on prairies was grazing. Before we introduced fences and row crop agriculture and all the necessities that we need to urbanize, we were lucky enough to have 30 to 60 million bison on the plains. I don't know if any of you have been lucky enough to see bison, but they are immense. I'm waiting for the ambulance to go by. Okay. So they are immense. So can you possibly imagine multi-ton animals running, turning up the soil, moving seeds around, knocking into anything that was in their way, or to scratch their backs if they felt like it? It's an incredibly destructive force. And there's a reason why they're considered a major disturbance in the prairies. Of course, they were not alone. Pronghorn, elk, and deer never get as much of the credit, despite being equally cool large mammals in the country. And today we do our best with what we have, which is primarily sheep, goats, and cows, and in some cases, when we're lucky, still bison. So grazing can be used to control invasives if it's done well. Johnson grass that drives everybody bonkers, including myself, if it is grazed heavily enough in the beginning of the season over multiple seasons, cannot compete, is one of the most effective ways actually to get rid of it. Yep. You can use goats to target invasive forbs in particular because they love eating very weird things because that's their whole shtick. And you can arguably use cows and goats together to manage your invasives and produce the grasslands that you like, especially if you do it the holistic way. So you're rotating your grazing. And if you are wanting to hit all of the great prairie boxes, you burn and rotate on your ranches. It's going to produce the best results for your prairie communities. But like everything else, this disturbance has also changed throughout the state. Not largely because of urbanization, but just from change in opinion and personality, mostly. So we have improved pastures, which were very aggressively marketed as being better forage for cattle. Most of those grasses were imported from other countries, whether that is Old World Bluestem, Coastal Bermuda. They were viewed as being better forage. So a lot of our working lands actually have introduced grasses and invasive grasses. But also, if you don't manage your grazing regime very well, your grazing system, you end up with a grazing lawn, which is a nice way of saying that you have a biodiversity of maybe 5 or 6 species. They're all the ones that the cows look at and go, ew, and don't want to touch, to be honest with you, which means you end up with a lot of very stinky plants, especially the ones with camphor. For whatever reason, cows don't want to eat plants with camphor. I can't say that I blame them. And it makes them very prone and vulnerable to invasive species. So if you go anywhere that has been very heavily grazed, I can almost guarantee you're going to have invasive species in there that you're not going to see in healthy prairies. Makes them incredibly vulnerable. And if you happen to know anyone that has cows for any variety of reasons, there is an amazing case for them to go back to native plants if they're not already. And these are old numbers, arguably. The cost is probably way higher now. But in 2019, the average cost per head of cow was $898. That profit was $556 per cow, which means you end up with a net loss of $275 per head of cattle. Most of that is in hay cost. That is not including their time, most of the supplements, transportation, any of the other extras. And landowners that switch to native species, particularly if they rotate and do holistic grazing, don't usually have hay. And if they do, it's very few rolls and bales, and just in case. Actually, I have 2 landowners that turn a profit raising cattle, which is more or less unheard of, and they graze native. But for most of us, especially in urban spaces, because of close neighbors being leery of wildfire, not willing to sign off on a prescribed burn, or for whatever reason don't want to live next to a happy herd of cows or goats, or perhaps they're not allowed, what we're typically left with is haying and mowing. As you can imagine, this is a potential invasive species vector nightmare, because anyone you hire is likely going to just bring in their equipment and do what they do and get the job done. You do not know where it's been. And if it has been any of the introduced species for hay, you're going to end up with a lot of unhappy folks with more invasive species than they expected. It's very difficult to clean haying and mowing equipment. But if you have no other option, any disturbance is better than no disturbance because you end up with woodies instead. But most importantly, it's good to know who responds really, really well to mowing. So this is probably the largest issue around some of NPSOT-Aug's prairies right now. Thankfully, is not infiltrated too deeply, but we're keeping an eye on it. That is scabiosa or pincushion, which amusingly is also marketed on nurseries as being incredibly drought tolerant, so that's fun. But it responds really, really well to mowing. If you mow pincushions, you're going to end up with a monoculture of pincushions. Burn. If you can burn, burn. If you cannot burn, your options are to either leave them alone and hope that you have a strong enough community to outcompete them and they will stay happy in a small little area, or you herbicide. But if you mow at the wrong time, you end up with a monoculture of pincushions. And the only thing out of human control that was a major disturbance influence on the prairies is drought. So it's believed that the Great Plains has a 20-year drought frequency. So every 20 years, we have a 5 to 10-year drought, at least historically. As we all know, things are rapidly changing and we can't depend on a steady number anymore. But what drought cycles do is it can favor native species. So if we're lucky on the other side of this year, natives being more drought tolerant and more used to being water stressed are going to do really well. And some of those invaders are not going to be as well adapted and start to peter off. What has folks like myself worried, and anyone that makes their living off of the land right now, is if we have a really extensive prolonged drought, 3, 5, many sequential years. I'm hoping just for 2 personally. What can happen is then you end up with damage to your perennial species, which are really hard to repropagate. If you don't have seed from wild species that you've hand collected, typically you cannot find them to try to reintroduce them. And drought can have a really catastrophic effect on them. And unfortunately, it can favor some of those aggressive annuals that are going to get reintroduced from things like mowers. There's another thing that I would like to address related to drought, and this is the deep water myth. So even though switchgrass roots reach 12 feet deep, they're only pulling water from a very shallow portion of the water table, while native forbs go just a little bit deeper. So we're talking about 50 to 75 centimeters in the water column, in the soil, so relatively shallow. Unfortunately, shrubs, trees, and all the woody species that we would like to keep out of prairies to keep them open in prairie ecosystems pull their water from way deeper. So if we end up with a 5-year drought, what we could see is things like aromatic sumac spreading very, very rapidly, like the one you can see in this picture here. And part of the reason for that is being a clonal species. The first clone is going to pass water to the newer clone, so they will actually share water resources, which makes them particularly nasty to try and manage. I put this in originally in March, trying to warn everybody that we were headed towards an intensive drought. I think the cat's out of the bag on that one, and everyone is well aware. But what I would like to point out, and the reason why it's still in, is notice that we're getting more extreme droughts closer and closer together. And unfortunately, that's just going to be the reality for things to come in the future, which means as managers looking at invasive species and trying to keep our natives happy and healthy, we're now going to have to account for this in our management plans as well. And realistically, climate change has already impacted Texas. Our average temperatures have increased by 1 to 2 degrees Fahrenheit already. I would say that we've felt this mostly at night, but I think this summer has proven that's a lie. And ultimately, it's expected to get worse from here. We're projecting increases of 3 to 5 degrees by the mid-21st century. And again, increasing propensity for drought. So those cycles are going to get closer and closer together. But what sometimes folks don't realize is that when we have a really extreme drought like we had in 2011 to 2013, when we finally do get that long wanted rain and it comes in a heavy torrential downpour, we flood. The soil is not prepared for it. It's not going to percolate as well as we want it to. And especially anywhere that we have a high number of invasive species with very shallow root systems, we're going to see impacts from that downstream, and we're going to have more and more catastrophic flooding. So as you can imagine, climate change plus invasive species definitely equals trouble. Species ranges are already shifting. It's almost impossible to predict. That's both native and invasive species as we know them. We have increasing volatility in weather events. We just had a major frost and now we are in a catastrophic drought. No one could have written this unless they were writing for a soap opera. And unfortunately, that's going to favor generalist species like most of our invasives, particularly those annual plants like pincushions, as well as cheatgrass. But another particularly nasty element of all of this is what the increased carbon dioxide does. Because it helps along those woody species that are already tricky to control because they're better at pulling water. And without burns or disturbance, they're just taking over more and more of our prairies, as well as the invasive C4 or warm season grasses. And ultimately, a warming temperature just in general is going to favor some invasives that are acclimated to it. They came from warmer environments. One of those, unfortunately, is sheetgrass, which increases, again, our wildfire risk. But ultimately, when we look at how can we possibly control invasive species, we have to talk about the invasion curve. And most of the time, by the time the public is aware of where we are in our invasion, we are dangerously close to only being able to control it through local management. Cat's already out of the bag. There's no putting it back in. All we can do is try and triage and minimize its impacts. There are very rare cases where we've actually managed to catch them early, unfortunately. And when we do, it's generally not hitting the news. So that leaves land managers such as myself to fight back invasion. For prairies, we're going to lean towards our good tools of fire and grazing, goats everywhere, prescribe birds as often as we can. And when we can't, mechanical removal. MPAT haze, that's one of the ways we keep our prairies open out in Northeast Texas. Chainsaws and loppers are our best friend in many cases, as long as we stump treat. If you don't stump treat, you might as well save yourself the money on the gas. And for animal species, it's ultimately down to traps, bait, and if necessary, lethal measures. And for feral hogs, honestly, the best option we have is a really strong offense. If a landowner has the means to put up hog fencing, it's probably the best way to deal with the problem because they are smart. They will learn your traps and avoid them. And unless you have a helicopter crew or dedication to sit out there and try and get rid of them all, they're pretty pesky. And what is particularly vexing about a lot of the plants is the methods we have to control them are ecoregion specific. What works on KR bluestem down in coastal prairie does not work effectively in Blackland prairie. So it's a lot of trial and error to try and find a way to keep them under control. And it's a lot of land managers literally swapping notes of, did this work for you? And what this end up looking like practically is now we have to manage for multiple invasives. So it becomes a personal hit list of who is worse on my property and who am I most worried about? What's going on this year, and is it going to favor Johnson grass or pincushions or maybe KR bluestem? So if I were presented with a prairie where these were my 3 biggest invasive species I'm worried about, which often it is, my eyes immediately turning to Johnson grass is particularly nasty. It's actually better in some cases, to hold its own against complex communities and invade healthy prairies better than KR bluestem can. So if I had a choice of who to go after first, I'm going to target Johnson grass. I'm going to try, if I can, to graze it and graze it heavy very early in the year and try and get rid of it that way. And then I'll look at my KR blue stem and say, okay, how are you doing? Are you staying in a relatively small area because you're being outcompeted? Because it can be outcompeted by healthy prairies. And if it is, I might decide you're not worth the effort today. I'm going to turn my effort to cedar trees or mesquite instead. And for pincushions, as we talked about earlier, I'm just going to watch it and make sure it's not mowed and herbicide it. And what ultimately ends up happening is those species that are really low on the worry list, perhaps in some areas, the KR blue stem, it might just end up being naturalized. That's where we throw up our hands and say, you're here to stay. I wish you weren't here to begin with, but you're at the point now where you're fitting into the slot. Hopefully you're not going to cause too much damage anymore. Hopefully things know how to eat you at this point. And I can just consider you a least preferred plant. And we have a lot of those. Honestly, the European starling is at this point, they're here to stay. They're actually fantastic study organisms. And other animals, again, we brought them here because we like them, such as the pheasant. It becomes, we actually dedicate an incredible amount of money to increasing pheasant populations. We brought them over multiple times from Eurasia to get them to stick, by the way. So it just becomes a priority list for everybody. And this is where this tricky balance piece comes in. Texas is changing. We're going to have to deal with more and more invasive species. We're going to have to deal with not having all of our favorite tools in our back pockets as much as we would like. So it means we're going to have to find a way to add some disturbance, whether that is just resorting to hay, or if that is trying to convince all of our neighbors that they need to be prescribed burn fans. It means working with those species that can be outcompeted. KR blue stem is not going to keep me up at night as much as Johnson grass will. It means mitigating those worst invasives first and trying to reduce that stress as much as possible. It's also why conserving those large tracts of prairie is absolutely essential. The larger the piece, the likely the healthier the community is, though that's not always true. It also means we're going to have more genetic diversity to rescue some of those smaller parcels, which are inevitable with increasing urbanization. But it also means, in my opinion, that changing how we use urban spaces is absolutely critical. Because urbanization of Texas is just going to happen. And there is hope for a prairie state. I try not to leave with everybody down in doom and gloom. We do have a substantial shift in mindset in agriculture, at least for working lands. More and more folks are interested in doing patch rotation grazing, and if they get hooked on that because they see better results for their profit margins, typically they're going to move closer and closer to wanting to put back in native species, which we're all a massive fan of. And in urban spaces, NPSOT is getting more and more people contacting us, either wanting to put in a pocket prairie or restore completely to native species, which is absolutely amazing. Totally for that. And we do offer some resources. Right now, this is only Houston-based. It's the 9 Natives program that was put together by our NPSOT chapter down in Houston, along with some of our partner organizations as well. And not to add anything to your organization's to-do list, but if anyone is interested, we are eventually looking at doing this for the DFW region as well. Yes.
Alex is well represented. Saying that, it doesn't mean we don't want more representation. But this is a long-term project. It took them about 6 years in Houston.
It did.
So, and we want it to become the unified message put out by organizations, universities, cities, water departments,
yep.
So that everybody, every citizen gets exposed to it. And to have native plants in every retail outlet. I'm not sure we're gonna have garden plans, and it's a big project.
It is absolutely a big project.
And they are asking for the statewide NPSOT to be the sponsoring entity as a 501c3 so they can apply for grants and things like that. At least our chapter, our area, and it's all of the Metroplex working together.
It is. Thank you so much for your contributions already. I will get off of my soapbox. I didn't need to bring it today. And for now, if you're curious, you can see the Houston equivalent on NPAT's website. It's also, I believe, still hosted on the Katy Prairie, now Coastal Prairie Initiative, I believe, website as well.
And just FYI, the name is changing to non-native plants. because
Support.
it was not very good name for it in light of our population.
Fair enough. Thank you so much. Okay, I'll bring my soapbox out just one more time. You can absolutely help and advocate for prairies. In my firm opinion, if we have room for turf grass, we have room for something prettier and better and way cooler and less intense on our limited water supply. Who wants to mow in 100-degree heat? Why do we not have buffalo grass literally everywhere? I do not understand. But anyway, if you would like to get on the soapbox with me, or if you already are, fantastic. Anywhere there is a lawn, there does not need to be a lawn. And I'm happy to come back you up in any of these conversations with any of these entities listed above. And if you're feeling particularly frustrated, you can absolutely join NPAT and come with your favorite pair of destructive loppers and help us tackle your invasive species of your choice. We have many to pick from, unfortunately. And before I take questions, I want to bring up a couple of events that we have on September 24th. We're going to have our next Prairie Seekers Toolbox series. So this is basically an all-day, more or less, in-field workshop identifying plants, looking at influences on prairie communities. In particular, since we're going to be at the Fort Worth Nature Center on the 24th, we're going to be looking at the impacts of my favorite thing in this talk, prescribed burns. So if you're interested, please go to texasprairie.org to register. We are providing lunch as well. If you have any questions, contact me. It's one of my events. And in October, if you are interested in looking more at this interface between inevitable urbanization and keeping our open spaces, we are having a fundraiser event called People for Prairies on October 1st in Flower Mound. It's going to be a lot of fun. There's going to be good food, good music, and also a panel of 5 experts from a variety of different areas, including development, urban planning, corporations, private landowners, and natural resources, talking about precisely this question. So if you can, please join us. And with that, I'm happy to take any and all questions, and if I can't answer them, I will find an answer for you and get back. Yes.
How do you get rid of your St. Augustine, and what do you do during the transition? I mean, can you do patches at a time?
It's tricky. The question for anyone who didn't hear it on Zoom is what to do with St. Augustine. It gets tricky with any of the turf grasses to do them a patch at a time because they're generally pretty prolific at coming back. Your best option is to stress it as much as you can with most of your invasives. So get it nice and happy, water it, mow it, water it, mow it, water it, mow it, and get it to the point where it's exhausted. And then honestly, you'll probably want to herbicide it. I don't know personally of any examples of using solarization or a little bit gentler methods like we have for Bermuda grass to try and knock it out, but you're going to want it as stressed as possible. For St. Augustine, awesome. But you want them stressed first.
Right now, we haven't been watering, and it looks pretty fresh.
Go for it. It is 100 degrees. Tell me if it bakes.
We watered
That's fair.
for a while.
Yes, Carol.
The juniper going up in flame,
Yes.
do the ash juniper and the going flame equally, or is one more
That is a very good question. To my knowledge, they're both fairly volatile, but the examples I know of them going up to that intensity are almost exclusively eastern red cedars. That is one I will find out for you, but I suspect they both do. And I'll check. Any questions in chat? Okay. Yeah.
Well, but I don't know if you could be an answer, except that you brought up the secret muzzle.
Yes.
About how much money was spent on it. How? What they do?
A lot of it is educational campaign as far as I'm aware. And I don't know how much TPWD actually does on the ground, but I suspect it's a lot. So it's probably a combination of research, public outreach, and anything they can do to try and actually remove them is my suspicion.
Where's the money going?
What would help is water sources when you pull your boat out, and I put a kayak out, I use the wash. I mean,
Yep.
Or, you know, bigger boat, down.
Yeah. That's fair. I'm not as familiar with mussels, but for example, some of the control efforts for feral pigs will throw money into satellite transmitters. So they essentially give them a GPS to wear. So we can figure out what they do in their spare time every 2 hours to try and prevent them from being in those locations in the future.
You
Yes,
mentioned
ma'am.
you mentioned the Scabiosa and the
Mhm.
Nurseries Pro. It is my understanding they're 2 different species. So the ones that are sold in nurseries are not the same as the invasives we see out on the roadsides and stuff. Are you saying that's different?
I am not.
Oh, okay.
But the varieties that you can buy in nurseries are targeted as being drought resistant in particular.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. I didn't notice some clumsy wordplay there.
Oh, wow.
And if you have any questions, or I noticed field trips was one of your open positions. If you happen to fill your field trip position and would like to come see intact remnant Blackland Prairie, please contact me. I love taking people out onto MPAT properties and talking about prairie ecology and just getting folks out. I promise you won't have to bring your loppers unless you want to. So that is an excellent question. Nearby prairies. Are you talking large intact remnants or stuff that you can access from them? Okay. So MPAT has properties spread throughout the state, depending on how ambitious your field trips are. We do have a 100-acre Blackland remnant that is just outside of Farmersville. It's absolutely gorgeous. It has intact gilgai, which is that really awesome pocketed topography, which thankfully makes it really hard to mow. So it means a lot of the plants were left there. Yay. We also have properties out by New Boston. We have a pair of prairies that were donated to us by a mother and son. So we have absolutely gorgeous Sylvius dropseed prairies. That is a type of prairie that is only found in Texas. It is a unique ecosystem named for the Sylvius dropseed plant. You get some really cool mixes of stuff, and you also get Mima mounts, so the exact opposite of Matthews with its gilgai. If you're interested in going far west, we have 1,000 acres out by Colorado City of rolling plains with mixed grass prairie. Is absolutely gorgeous and one of my favorite places to go. So if you are very ambitious and want to go spend a night out at Colorado City and run around on 1,000 acres of rolling plains, I will absolutely be there with bells on. It's beautiful. And outside of that, we have our ongoing restoration now. Just outside of Houston, the Dow Ranch is MPAT's new headquarters. It was one that you can describe as a grazing lawn for most of it. So it is getting some love as we speak and getting restored. So that's going to be exciting to watch over the next couple of years. So for MPAT properties, those are probably the closest to the Metroplex.
But we do have wetland prairie remnants at White Rock Lake.
You do, and it's
And that's-
amazing.
And Frankfurt.
Yes, and Frank,
Where on Frankfurt?
just east of the toll road at the Episcopal Church.
There's a creek that goes through it. Down there.
Yes.
Okay.
If you follow them on Facebook, they've already scheduled the fall walk.
That's awesome.
You can go out there and do karaoke anytime.
Go for it.
Carly, do you know if they're gonna resume the bus tours of the East Texas?
There's
Prairies.
been discussions and rumors, but nothing that has moved forward. If there's enough organizational interest from other folks, that might be something that can happen, because everybody who was involved with the first one absolutely loved it. So if that's something that you want, shoot us an email and that might get it pushed along a little further. And for publicly accessible prairies, something that I've been working on right now is actually putting together a map of everything I can find in Texas that is open to the public. So the other part of your question will hopefully be easier to answer soon.
Grass, native grass.
They are. It looked like they had still a pretty good side oats grama year despite the drought, which is awesome.
Yeah.
Well, thank you all.